Go. Hey, if there's one thing that comic book fans agree on, is that comic book fans don't agree on anything. So let's take a look at a confusing era that leads to a lot of debate in the history of comic books. Okay, if you've spent any time studying the history of comic books, then you know that the comic book history is divided into ages, right? So the first one that historians normally talk about is the Golden Age. Some people point out that before the Golden Age, there was something called the Platinum Age, where all the elements of comic books came together, but most historians start with the Golden Age. And the Golden Age begins in 1938 with the introduction of Superman in Action Comics #1. This is really the introduction of the superhero genre into comic books. Superman gets introduced, and through the Golden Age, which lasts, depending on who you talk to, till about 1959, is where we start to get all of the different elements that are going to make this medium what it is. The Golden Age ends, by most people's account, with Showcase #4, which is the introduction of the Barry Allen version of The Flash in 1959. But I should mention here that some people actually say the Golden Age ended in 1949 because that was when superhero popularity dipped and other genres took over for about 9 years. So from 1950 to 1959 is sometimes referred to as the Atomic Age, wherein we see EC horror, science fiction, romance, and westerns really dominate the medium until The Flash is introduced in Showcase #4.
I disagree. I believe that the Golden Age ends when Fantastic Four #1 appears and Marvel starts to take the lead in the comic book industry. But this isn't my video.
More on that whole thing about Marvel soon, though, because they do play an important part of this. Now, we jump now to the Silver Age. According to most comic book historians, the Silver Age begins in Showcase #4 with the introduction of the Barry Allen version of The Flash.
Not me.
Well, most people accept this because it's the reintroduction and repopularization of superheroes after the beginning of the Comics Code Authority. Now, the Silver Age lasts to the early 1970s. The exact year, though, is in a bit of a debate, and it's for the same reason that the Copper Age is very, very confusing. We'll get to it in a minute. Some people think the Bronze Age, the age after the Silver Age, begins with the beginning of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, because it was a socially conscious comic book series and brought a little more seriousness and gravity to the stories that they told. Other people believe that the Bronze Age begins and Silver Age ends with Amazing Spider-Man #122, which contains the death of Gwen Stacy, where we first see mortality as a real and lasting effect on characters' lives. So this would be the kickoff of what's called the Bronze Age. Through the 1970s, it's a weird shifting time for the comic book industry. There's a lot of economic ups and downs for the industry. They try out different things. A lot of weird stuff gets introduced in the 70s during the Bronze Age. We get weird stuff like Howard the Duck and Killraven from Marvel. DC introduces things like Brother Power and some things like Prez and some of the real offbeat horror stuff that DC starts getting into, like House of Mystery and things like that. Now, when I was younger and we used to read about the history of comic books, the period after the Bronze Age was often referred to as the Dark Ages or the Modern Age. But recently I've noticed a lot of people start referring to the era after the Bronze Age as the Copper Age. This is a term I've never heard before, but I'm going to go with it. And what I'd like to try to do is figure out, with your help, what the heck is the Copper Age? When does it start and when does it end? So, we're all agreeing to call it the Copper Age for the moment, let's say.
Not all of us.
Except for the contrarians among us. Anyway, the Copper Age kicks off with 3 possibilities. Either 1983, with the introduction of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1, which is the first independent comic to hit sales levels 2 years after the Bronze Age. This is the first time that prior unheard of in the independent comic industry.
So why don't we call it the Independent Age?
Good question. The other possibility, 1984, is the Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars series, which is the first event comic. 12 issues. They gather all of the heroes and villains in one place, and they have a battle that has a lasting effect on continuity. Kind of lasting effect on continuity. Written by Jim Shooter and illustrated by Mike Zeck. I'm sure if you're a comic book fan, you are familiar with the Secret Wars series. The last possibility, 1985, is DC Comics' Crisis on Infinite Earths, which a lot of people point to, and there's a lot of evidence to support. This is the real beginning of the Copper Age. Written by Marv Wolfman and illustrated by George Perez, it is a large series like Secret Wars. It's 12 issues, but its effects are much larger and much further reaching than anything that happens in Secret Wars.
So what happens in Crisis is that DC takes all their multiverse universes, which have been created since the early days of DC, back when Action Comics #1 started, and they kind of trim them down and get them to one specific universe that lasts all of maybe 5 years, and then they start to make more alternate universes, and then we get another Crisis later on. So let's, Brian, keep going.
Thanks, Chad. There are valid arguments for all of them. I like the idea of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kicking off the era because I'm partial to independent comics. And there was a boom of black and white comics that followed in the 80s that did a lot of crazy stuff that was well outside the norm. But if we're going to stick with history here, history is usually started or ended by something happening in DC Comics. I know you guys aren't all DC fans, and some of you are probably chanting, Secret Wars, because you're Marvel fans. I get it. But if you look back at the past ages, they were always kind of started and ended by something that happened in DC Comics.
Mostly the Flash.
Mostly the Flash, that's right. And if you guys are ever interested, there's plenty of different DC Crisis storylines we could go through. If you're interested in like a recap of the Crisis, just let us know. Anyway, I like Secret Wars a lot. It's a great, fun comic. It was a much better comic, really, than it should have been, considering that it was originally created to sell a line of action figures. If you want a history on those action figures, let me know. But in my way of looking at things, it's got to be Crisis on Infinite Earths. That is the... Oh, here's the Daredevil Secret Wars figure. By the way, I don't believe he was actually in the comic story. That happened a lot with the Secret Wars figures. We could talk about that later. Anyway, I have to say, my way of looking at things, it's definitely Crisis on Infinite Earths that kicks off the Copper Age. Because, Chad explained, it changed the entire continuity of DC Comics. A continuity that had been going on since 1938. And reintroduced characters from the Golden Age and cut out a lot of stuff from the Silver Age. Major character deaths occurred. Supergirl died. Barry Allen died. Now, again, they didn't stay dead because who does in comics, but they were gone from the comics for decades before they were reintroduced. So again, my argument is Crisis on Infinite Earths. If you disagree with me, please let me know in the comments below. So, let me know. If you think it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that should be the beginning of the Copper Age, if you think it is Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, or if you think or you agree with me and think it should be Crisis on Infinite Earths, please let me know in the comments. I'm looking for a healthy debate here. Healthy debate. Now, just like the beginning of the Copper Age is a bit of a controversy, the end is also a controversy. And a controversy that could be the difference in almost 15 years of history. Some people out there think the Copper Age ended with the beginning of Image Comics in 1992, because it kicked off the speculator boom era, which probably should have a title all its own, something like the Iron Age or whatever, something like that. But I think the Iron Age might be something else. Anyway, some people think that the Copper Age ends with the beginning of the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with the first Iron Man movie, because that's where we see comic books really being mined for intellectual property to create billion-dollar film franchises. My argument with that would be, what about 1989's Batman? That was kind of the beginning of a superhero movie trend. Nowhere near as big as the MCU, of course, but it still kind of turned comic books into IP at that time. Finally, the last argument, and the one I happen to agree with, is that the Copper Age ends with the beginning of DC's New 52. This was the first... I'm sorry. Hold on a minute. You're going to watch me debate with myself right here on video. This was the first really major reboot of DC's universe since Crisis on Infinite Earths. And because my argument stays with the idea that the ages begin and end with DC and DC events, New 52 is probably the end of the Copper Age. Not only does it revamp old DC continuity one more time, starting with Flashpoint and then going through 52 and then into the New 52, but it's also the beginning of the nearly non-stop rebooting and retcons we see in the age that comes after, what people are now referring to as the modern age.
Or the retcon age.
Or the retcon age, which is a good name for it. So, finally, I end with a question for you. What do you think? Do you agree with my ideas here, my inferences about the beginning and end of the Copper Age? What's your definition of the Copper Age? Where do you think it starts? Where does it end? Please let us know in the comments. And don't forget, collect what you love and love what you collect.
Except if it's Bronze Age.